Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I'm Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Simbler Miller.
US government and Jewish organizations have recently started to push back hard against anti Semitism at American universities. Yet, the aggressive so called resistance movement against Israel's policies, existence, and supporters is still going strong on many campuses. We will discuss this with Andrew Passin, professor of philosophy at Connecticut College and campus bureau editor for the Jewish online media outlet Allgemeiner. He was he has experienced anti-Semitism on campus firsthand and published articles and books about it. Recently, he published his bundled essays titled Israel Breathes, World Condemns. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on our podcast, and it's an honor to have you as our guest.
Evelyn and Phyllis, thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to be here as your guest.
Thank you.
Andrew, can you please share with us both your firsthand experience of anti Semitism on college campuses and what you see going on in other college campuses?
Sure, and that could fill up the whole 30 to 40 minutes we have, but I will try to be, and feel free to interrupt. I'll try to be brief. The historian Gil Troy refers to the idea that every person has their Heritzel moment, Herzl being, of course, the founder of modern political Zionism. And by that, he means the moment when you realize that anti-Semitism is a serious problem. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so different people come to this place over the last 10 or 15 years at different times with different impetus. My own experience really began about 10 years ago when I had written a Facebook post essentially supporting Israel's war against Hamas back in 2014. So it seems like so quaint, a long time ago. And that Facebook post was then taken wildly out of context and ended up leading to an international death threat generating campaign against me. And that was the moment when I just saw and understood in a way that no argument can get you to that basically anti-Zionism, the hostility to Israel, really is just a manifestation of anti-Semitism. And again, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So that was my Herzl moment about 10 years ago. And since that moment, I sort of rededicated my life to fighting, to at least documenting and fighting this scourge. So I became campus bureau editor for the Allgemeiner, which, as you mentioned, is a wonderful news outlet that focuses on Jews in Israel. And I do recommend that your viewers and listeners go to allgemeiner.com and just sign up for the daily newsletter, the email newsletter. It's free. And it's, the first thing you need to do if you care about this issue and want to do anything about it is be informed about it. And as campus bureau editor, I've spent the last 9 years watching the campus scene very, very closely. And that gives me this unfortunate perspective. I'm not a pleasant person to have at parties because I have a fairly dark image of what's been happening. And I've sort of watched it go from relatively small scale, both in intensity and in quantity, to just literally not doubling every year, but growing every year. And obviously, from October 7th, the October 7th massacre onwards, it's just absolutely exploded. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But what I say about October 7th, not so much the massacre itself, but the response to it on college campuses. In fact, it was not the least bit of a surprise to me that campuses would respond in that way. That didn't make it any less shocking to actually see it happen. It's almost in disbelief, but it really was. That campus response was the next step in the trajectory that I've been tracking really for the last 9 or 10 years or so. So my own experience 10 years ago. More recently, what I will say on my own campus, which has been relatively quiet compared to the campuses that are in the news primarily. And I'm grateful for that. I think all campuses should largely be quiet on this issue because campuses should be devoted to scholarly pursuits and they shouldn't be about activism. We can have that conversation later. But what I did have on my campus is several very hostile to Israel faculty members have put together now. It's a 13 lecture series dating back to last year. They've all been on Zoom, which is also something to be thankful for. But it's literally 13 lectures, one after the other, hating Israel, condemning Israel, Israel's evil this, Israel evil that, et cetera, et cetera, condemning every aspect of the war, condemning Israel's existence. And so, in my view, what they're trying to do is get our students riled up to become Israel haters, and they are succeeding. They have created some student activity where previously there had largely been none. And to my mind, unambiguously, this type of activity is ultimately anti-Semitic, and happy to go into more detail about that. And I'm essentially on my campus the only voice who speaks up against this. So I've written several pieces criticizing this lecture series, criticizing not just the individual lecturers and lecturers, of which there were many lies, misrepresentations, distortions, omissions, the usual things in the anti-Zionist playbook, but also criticizing the idea of a lecture series as a whole. Sure, bring in 2 or 3 lecturers. Our job is to educate people, even if they're one-sided lectures. But when you bring in 13, something's gone wrong there, right? You're really trying to rile up the people and inflict all this propaganda on them. Yeah,
I want to just clarify something. So
sure.
Connecticut College itself invited these professors.
No, so 4 faculty members invited a series of lecturers to come in from different places, a total of 13. Connecticut College initially supported it, but I wouldn't read anything into that. Really, any faculty member who says, "Can I get some money to bring in a speaker?" They just say yes. They did after a certain number of them, and I complained vociferously. They stopped supporting the series because, fine, we'll bring in 2 or 3 lecturers. But after a while, 13 lectures, the college did stop supporting that after a certain number. So it wasn't an official college thing. It was these 4 faculty members.
So you wrote somewhere that when Hamas massacred the civilians of a democracy on October 7th, the dominant campus response was to blame the democracy, not the terrorists.
Yeah.
So in your new book, Israel Breathes, World Condemns, you show this response is not surprising given the development on campuses years before October 7.
Yeah.
What was that development?
Thank you for that question, which again could be its own 30 to 40-minute thing. And I will take some praise for limiting my previous answer to like whatever that was, 7 or 8 minutes.
Very well done. Yes.
So that expression that they, when the terrorists attacked the democracy, the students criticized the democracy. I borrow that from a scholar named Richard Landis, who published a book about a year and a half ago, just shortly before October 7th. And the book is called, it's on my shelf somewhere, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? And I ended up writing a review of that book. And the title for the review was The Book That Saw October 7th Coming from a Mile Away. Richard Landis saw these things, these trends and traits going back at least 20 years. So I do commend his work to your listener. And he's filled with pithy expressions like when the terrorists attack a democracy, the people criticize the democracy. So in terms of the pattern or trajectory, what we've seen on campuses, let me focus on the more recent part of it. There's really 2 components. There's the roughly 20-year-old BDS movement, which stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. And this is a formal, official anti-Israel movement that it's continuous with the Arab boycotts of Israel dating back well over a century. But as a sort of modern movement, it really begins in the early 2000s and spreads over campuses. And what the BDS movement typically represented, the main student organization that propagates this BDS movement on campuses, is called Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP. SJP began with a couple of chapters on a couple of campuses some 20 years ago. They now say they have more than 300 chapters in North America. So every major campus, the elite campuses, the next to elite campuses, all have SJPs. And so SJPs bring this BDS campaign to campuses, which has many, many components, but they've been doing it for 20 years. And essentially what they do is they soak these campuses just in lies, in anti-Israel lies, misrepresentations, distortions, omissions, etc. So that's sort of the first part of this whole
Wait, I want to know
trajectory.
something. Do they know that they're lies?
That is a fine question. So that's a fine question. So a typical SJP will have a few sort of rabid activists running it, and then there's all sorts of hangers on, right? There'll be like an inner core and then a kind of outer thing, and then there's stragglers. And part of what's happened over the last 20 years, and this is especially due to the second thing I'm going to talk about in just a moment, is it's become really cool to hate Israel. Like hating Israel, which is, of course, a socially acceptable way of hating the Jews, right? It fulfills that deeper anti-Semitic need that is just built into the hearts of almost everybody. It's become cool on campuses without question. Zionists are not cool. Zionists are everywhere from evil at worst to just uncool at best. And so, if it's cool to hate Israel, then you're going to have the people who, who's not into a nice protest, especially the encampments last year where they put up tents some places. What fun, right? I mean, that is just a good time hanging out, sleeping out in the tents, singing songs around a campfire, right? So like,
Pizza, pizza.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. So the outer circles, I think, don't know their lies, right? I think they hear a few things. They hear, the SJP people saying it's apartheid, it's ethnic cleansing, it's genocide, all the standard lies, and they just believe it because it's easier to believe it. And anyway, it's cool and fun to do it. I do believe the inner core mostly do know their lies, but I'll add a little asterisk to that because I'm a very charitable person, even towards people I have very little respect for, such as these. Um, and this is part of a reflection of our age, the disinformation age we live in, false, fake news, etc. And of course, the algorithms ensure we all live in a bubble. So if you click on a few anti-Israel stories, within a few days, you're only seeing anti-Israel stories, right? You don't break, and ditto for the pro-Israel people. The algorithms give you what they think you want based on your past history. And so even the core SJP people, I do think many of them know that they're lies. They have no hesitation. But they've also been just absorbing this information, this perspective for however many years, depends on the person. So I think there are some of them who sincerely believe it's true that Israel is an apartheid state. And it's easy to believe it's true because, after all, the UN says it. And I actually had a student in my class yesterday make a very good point. She says it looks like Zionists have to do these mental gymnastics to respond to the fact that really the whole world thinks Israel is evil. The UN thinks Israel is guilty of apartheid. All of the NGOs like Amnesty, non-government organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they put out 300-page reports with 1,000 footnotes documenting Israeli apartheid. And so you can't blame a student for thinking, of course, Israel is guilty of apartheid. The only way to respond to that, and by the way, Richard Landis, can the whole world be wrong? I ended up saying that to the student yesterday. You're right. It looks like nearly the whole world thinks Israel is guilty of just endless sins, but the whole world can be wrong, right? It's a hard position to be in as a Zionist to say we're right and 8 billion people in the world are wrong, but that happens to be the case, right? So the only way to respond against the apartheid charge. And again, the apartheid charge is just one of 10 major sins they, allege of Israel, is you actually have to look at the Amnesty International report claiming Israel is apartheid, and then you start realizing it's filled with lies and omissions and misrepresentations. They actually changed the definition of apartheid because the official legal one wouldn't apply to Israel. So they offer a different one, which only applies to Israel, right? So, and that's a lot of work, and most students are not going to do that work. So I do think the core people are comfortable with the lies, but many of them believe it. And certainly the outer people, I think, don't know that they're lies.
So it's the core group of the BDS movement on campus, and then it's the human rights organizations that confirm what the BDS
Right.
is saying. And is that what is making it so cool for the average student
S- s-
and maybe professor, or
Right.
are there other elements also involved in that?
Great question. Thank you. So there's a second component to explaining this trajectory, which I think was the original question.
Yeah, sorry.
Perfect. It was me who failed to come back to the second component, so you brought me back. So the first component is the now 20 years old BDS movement run by Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP. But what's been added to that, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, but especially since 2020 or so, is of course the contemporary, we'll call it the progressive movement, goes by a lot of different names. You might have heard of critical race theory, DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is sort of the contemporary manifestation of critical race theory. Wokeness is a popular expression now used mostly by people critical of the movement, but it was originally used by people supporting the movement. So I'll call all of that progressivism. It's the very, very left wing political movements, which are not merely dominant on campuses, but nearly exclusive on campuses, which is part of the deeper problem in the academy as a whole. And if we come back to it, what we started with, which was the government pushback, let's talk about the problem with the academy, with the universities. But the issue is, that this kind of ideology, progressivism, very left-wing ideology, as I said, isn't merely dominant, but it's nearly exclusive. So when they do surveys of like faculty members on the major colleges, the elite ones, second tier, et cetera, the numbers are frightening. It's something like 97% identify as Democrats or left-leaning, and 3% maybe identify as conservative or right-leaning. So it's 97 to 3, which is absurd, right? If academic institutions are supposed to be places of inquiry, you need a diversity of opinion, not merely diversity of skin color, but diversity of ideas. You need people to disagree. It's the best way to move forward in the pursuit of truth. But that's not what we have on campuses. We have these, especially the major campuses. And for those who are feeling I would be too depressing to bring to a party, let me just put one, not a ray of hope, but I'll put things in context. When we talk about the problem on campuses, there are something like 4,000 accredited higher education institutions in North America, including Canada. That's a very large number. The ones that are just absolutely awful and ridden with anti-Semitism are maybe 100 out of 4,000, right? So the large majority of campuses actually are quiet. They're filled by people like, commuting students or adult students, and they don't have time for any of this crap. Where do you see the hot spots happening? It's on the elite privileged campuses where students have the luxury of skipping class for 3 weeks to protest in an encampment. And that's fine because after all, who bought the tents? They're very rich parents and they're going to Harvard. And so they're going to get a great job even if they skip class for 3 weeks, et cetera. Really, the protest movement is such a privileged elitist movement. It's frightening because it's largely driven by basically the Islamist BDS movement and now the progressive movement. And the progressive movement is all about rejecting or criticizing privilege and trying to uplift the marginalized. So the irony is the very movement is a movement of privilege and their whole ideology is supposed to be combating privilege. So having said that, the question is, how does it become cool? So what you have is all of these left-leaning progressive groups on campuses, and there's loads. The certainly the Black Lives Matter groups. There are the Muslim groups. There's the Latino American groups. There's the gay lesbian groups. There's the trans groups. There's did I say Latino? Yeah, the Latino groups. There's the sexual assault groups. There's the environmental groups, etc. All of them, and they're all on the same side of this issue, which is really quite striking, even when it's absurd. So no group is more absurd. There's literally groups that go by the name Queers for Palestine, right? Arch anti-Israel, ultimately anti-Semitic groups. And they somehow make the claim that on the basis of being queer, we should be anti-Israel. And you cannot get more contorted reasoning there because, in Israel, Tel Aviv has the largest pride parade in the Middle East, not least because it has the only pride parade in the Middle East. And literally in quote unquote Palestine, especially Gaza, they'll throw you off a roof for being queer. And yet you have Queers for Palestine as part of the progressive movement. Why? How? It's crazy. It's insane. And why does the environmental club have to join this? And by the way, whenever there is a BDS resolution on a student government, so that was the main technique in the first part of this period, they would come to student government and they would try to get the student government to endorse boycotting, divesting from, or sanctioning Israel. it would always be led by the SJP, but then they'd have 20 or 30 or 40 other student groups as part of it. And it would be all the progressive groups that I was just listing. So it becomes this enormous coalition. And it's really a synthesis of what in the end is an Islamist group promoting the advancement of Islam across the West into the world, allying with progressive groups, which are archly against any other institutional religion, but are weirdly supportive of Islam. And so the Islamist groups are really far right groups, and the progressive groups are far left groups, and they disagree on everything except one thing: they hate the Jews. Right? Both groups hate the Jews, and so they create these alliances. And
Intersectionality is a word
and
that
intersectionality is the key word that they use. They actually are misusing what that means, but the way they use it is all forms of oppression are somehow inextricably linked. And since all progressive movements are about uplifting marginalized peoples, whether they are women, whether they are gay, whether they are people of color, whether they're Latinos, et cetera, they all work together because they're fighting the same fight. And they've put into that mix the Palestinians, who they see as the archetype of oppressed people. And so they join these coalitions. And since progressive ideology, for better or for worse, if we could just bracket out the anti-Israel part of it, I'm sure many people, the liberal elites in our country, who are very, very powerful and dominant, and of course, what Trump represents is a pushback to that. But the liberal elites, and probably the vast majority of Jews, and even me myself, who is very animated by the anti-Semitism issue, separate from anti-Semitism, prior to my own Heritzel moment 10 years ago, I was largely on board. Most American Jews are very progressive and very left-leaning. They want social justice. They want to uplift the marginalized. So there's a natural appeal to these groups, but
Yeah.
by this weird contortion, they've now made this alliance with the Palestinian cause as driven by SJP, and they've turned into just massive Jew haters. So because progressivism is cool, it is the dominant idea on the most of the campuses. That's why hating Israel is cool, because they've somehow worked the anti-Israel part into the progressive platform, which of course is ideologically absurd. It's contorted reasoning, and I can go at more length on that if you like. So we have these two important components of the trajectory. 20 years of BDS, which has been soaking these campuses with lies about Israel for all that time. Many of these campuses have what's called an apartheid week. They literally allow SJP to take over campus, and this has been going on before October 7th, for a whole week with a whole bunch of events, lectures, films, cultural things. And then they put up in the middle of campus an apartheid wall, which is supposed to represent the security barrier that Israel built to defend itself from suicide bombing in the Second Intifada. And then they cover it with all sorts of lies about Israel. And it's in the middle of the campus for a whole week. And it's allowed. It's really quite stunning. So you soak campuses with these lies, and pretty much, the large majority of students, as we were saying earlier, they don't know a whole lot. They just sort of, what do they know about Israel? Well, they hear some things about Israel: apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing. They don't know otherwise, so they simply accept these things. But now you join to that the rise of the progressive movement, like I said, over 15 years, but especially over the last 10, and especially since George Floyd and COVID, where there's almost a moral panic on these campuses about, triggered fighting for Black Lives Matter after the George Floyd affair. And I do think COVID made everybody a little extra crazier than they needed to be, that whole affair. So you had this foundation, which is, I guess, the fuel. And then, the progressive movement and George Floyd was the match that just had these campuses exploding in Jew hatred as we got into 2023, right? And then October 7th comes, and I'm sure many of your viewers and you yourselves and myself, I mean, that October 7th and 8th were two of the worst days of my life, just witnessing this thing occurring, and shock and horror, and the videos that were, all over the internet in those first few days. It was stunning. And then what do we discover? Literally the day it happens, on October 7th, The first people out of the gate was from Harvard, of course. Harvard, it was like 34 different student groups. The whole coalitions I was just mentioning put out a statement on the afternoon of October 7th. While the massacre was still ongoing, Israel hadn't begun its response. In fact, they had barely begun to push back on Hamas within Israel, much less begin going after Gaza. These 34 student Harvard groups put out a statement saying all the violence is Israel's fault. They had it coming, right? They had it coming. And just the stunningness, and even that the entire first week. And again, Israel doesn't begin its military response for at least a couple of weeks after October 7th, and it doesn't invade for at least like 3 weeks or more, right? So it's one thing when you can pretend you're protesting Israel's military action, even though that's unjustified too. But at least, Israel's attacking. This was before Israel was responding. They
Right.
were openly parading, celebrating. There were rallies on campus cheering October 7th. And why? Because they had swallowed hook, line, and sinker this set of lies about Israel, which makes Israel the most evil entity in the world. In particular, the key lie, I think I left it out of the earlier list. Israel's guilty of settler colonialism. The Jews don't belong there. They have no rights to be there. They came from outside. They kicked out the native indigenous Palestinians. And what we're seeing on October 7th, they said, is not literally an Islamist terrorist attack motivated by the quest to murder every Jew they can possibly murder. It was an act of national liberation against a colonial oppressor, right? That's how they saw it. And you know, and the last thing I'll say here is I could almost understand and accept if that was all they said. If the campus response was the following, it says like, "Oh my God, this was horrific and bloody, etc. But you know what? It's part of a national liberation movement against colonial oppression." I could almost respect that response, even though I reject it completely because it isn't colonial oppression. But that's not what we saw. What we saw was exaltation and glorification of the violence. They loved every bloody minute of it, right? So it's one thing to say it was horrible, but it was necessary for this national liberation. But that's not what we saw. We actually saw bloodlust, and that tells you something. This isn't a simply ideological thing about national liberation. This is enjoying watching Jews be massacred, right? That is to me the deepest tell that this is not a political response. It's not just anti-Zionism. It is bloodlust for Jews and enjoying seeing them just murdered in the most heinous, vicious, live streamed, horrific way. So, and I've not recovered from that. I'm deeply traumatized by October 7th and then by October 8th and what followed on campuses.
Right. Andrew, what I have experienced, I'm from Holland originally. What I have experienced in the early 2000s was a similar over enthusiastic anti-Israelism by the political left, by the progressives
Right.
then. And it seemed that it was nice to blame Israel for genocide because of the guilt feelings in Europe,
Yeah, right.
right? Now, today, about the Holocaust, you don't have those guilt feelings as much in America as in Europe, but
Right.
students these days, have already for a decade or so, learn in school and in college to be guilty about how America started out,
Right.
how the United States started out
Hmm.
by so-called genocide of Native Americans. So they feel bad about themselves, and then it's maybe also wonderful and an emotional relief to be able to blame
Right.
Israel for doing that and showing that you are against that. Is it the same mechanism, the relief of guilt?
What a terrific question. And lots of theorists do like to theorize in all sorts of ways, about these events. One of which is that someone famously said, name escaping me at the moment, that Europe will never forgive the Jews for the Holocaust, right? Which is
Exactly.
which is that idea that you were saying.
Yeah.
They hate having to feel guilty forever, and so they look for the release. That's a very, I think, insightful kind of analysis. If you can especially when you do the Holocaust inversion and say Israel is the new Nazis, which is a very popular trope, you can no longer feel guilty for, having exterminated them previously because they're evil. They deserve it, basically. So it surely satisfies some psychological need. The other part, so as if for America, which doesn't have this obviously the same Holocaust guilt, although I've recently been reading a little bit about FDR, and maybe we should have some more Holocaust guilt about our behaviors during that time. But the progressive movement, again, this is the final little piece of the puzzle, is really all about cultivating hatred for the West. Um, and it's actually quite stunning and misguided in my view. I'm actually teaching a course this semester, a brand new course called Big Ideas of the 20th Century. And the reason I wanted to teach this course was I wanted to learn more about these progressive ideas that I think are very problematic and that ultimately explain why so many students and faculty members hate the Jews. So I've actually been reading the key sort of post-colonialism texts when Edward Said is the main figure there. I don't know if your viewers would be
Yes.
aware of him, but
Orientalism.
Orientalism being the most famous book. And we've actually just been doing critical race theory and looking at a little bit of the pushback now. So, and what you see when you read this progressive movement is really, to put it very simply, that, and let's trace it back to Edward Said in particular, maybe the most influential academic of the last 50 years. He's been dead for about 20 years now, but he wrote this book called Orientalism. And in one sentence, Orientalism says something like this: all Western scholarship about the Middle East was in service to colonialism and imperialism and domination of the Middle East. That's Edward Said. And so what happened as a result of Orientalism was that the West came to represent everything that people see as evil. That includes, of course, the genocide, as you mentioned, of the Native Americans. Capitalism, first and foremost, is the root of all these evils. So the progressive movement is really a modern manifestation of Marxism. It's profoundly anti-capitalist. According to that ideology, capitalism is what produces colonialism. I think that's actually false, but that's their idea. So the West is guilty of genocide. It's guilty of capitalism, spreading capitalism across the globe, spreading colonialism across the globe. Of course, slavery and racism are in the mix as well. And so the West is evil. And because of Edward Said, who's a significant figure in developing this idea, the progressive groups, all of them share what I just said, that capitalism is evil, that colonialism is evil, obviously racism is evil, slavery was a manifestation of all of these things, and they blame the West and only the West. As a result of that, when they look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I feel obliged to say I prefer to call it the Israeli-Palestinian Jewish-Arab-Muslim-Iran conflict, or IPJAMIC, which is a mouthful, but it's because it's at least that complicated and more. I've managed to convince no one to adopt that acronym, but I'm working on it. But when they look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they now look at it through the progressive lens where the West is guilty of all of these things, and they see Israel as representing a Western colonialist implant in that world. And so they're going to hate Israel, right? The progressive ideology, not least because of this false lens applied to it. It is a mistaken lens to apply to that conflict. They will see it as white, Western, racist imperialists colonizing, the indigenous people of color. So yeah, Phyllis.
I so the one thing you didn't say here is democracy.
Democracy.
And I find it fascinating that the elite college students, who in many cases have wealthy parents who will give them Porsches, et cetera,
Yeah.
cannot make the leap from the fact that if we had a communist society,
Right.
they would, I suppose, some pigs are, more, what's the saying? Some pigs are more
Equal.
something than other pigs.
More equal
right.
than others.
Yeah, right. Some pigs are more right.
I just can't understand it. I can't understand how
Right.
you can attack democracy, because that's what this is.
So that's a huge question. And I know we're probably coming to, I'm good for a while longer, but just to finish the earlier one, then come back to that one. So I think the progressive ideology just casts Israel as this pure evil because it's an extension of the West. I suppose we could put in a guilt idea in there too, if we wanted to say, because at least to the degree that these students primarily, but they're also driven by faculty, are ashamed of the West, right? That's what this ideology is. In fact, some of the literature that the Columbia anti-Israel group was handing out, it begins, "We are Westerners whose goal is to destroy Western civilization." They openly say that, including this guy Mahmoud Khalil, who's currently being detained, at Columbia, a graduate student there. That was his group, and this is the literature they put out. They're ashamed of being Westerners, and so the way you get rid of that shame is you elevate the non-West, in this case, the Middle East and primarily Muslims and Arabs. You elevate them as a way of like apologizing to them for having oppressed them previously. So I suppose we could fit a guilt lens in there. We're guilty for being Westerners, and that's why we're anti-Israel, because that's a way of redeeming our guilt or some way, right? So
Scapegoat.
skate. I don't know if scapegoat's the right word. Maybe that could fit there, but it's like, yeah. To side with Israel is to continue to side in their mind with the West oppressing the Middle East. And so they have to get rid of that ideologically and maybe also psychologically. My own view, darker, is deep inside, almost everybody hates the Jews. And most people, under normal circumstances, it will never reach the surface. And they might not be aware of it. They won't say anything or they won't feel it. But in the right circumstances, when it's allowed to be channeled in socially acceptable ways, it comes out. So I think, and this was part of the bloodlust point earlier, right? I think they just really hate the Jews, and being anti-Israel allows you to hate the Jews, and no one's going to say you're a racist or an anti-Semite, right?
Why do you say that? It's Jew hatred, not Israel hatred.
I don't know that I could make. Actually, I could make an argument. I have a very long paper explaining why anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Lots of people like to disagree with that. So I think one could make the argument, and that would be a whole separate discussion, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. But in the end, it's more of the once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? You just, in the same way, using the progressive frame, the progressive frame is what says when a marginalized person speaks, you have to listen to what they say. That's part of uplifting the marginalized, and that's what got us into the Believe Her movement. If a woman says sexual assault occurred, you just have to accept her with no questions asked. If a black person says a certain incident involved racism, you just have to accept it. You can't begin to say, "Well, I don't think that was racist." That the marginalized person gets an air of authority in this ideology. And so if you were being consistent, you would say when a Jewish person says, what's happening here is anti-Semitism, you should listen to it. Of course, they don't, because they don't see Jews as being victims of oppression. They see Jews as being oppressors, so they won't accept that. But in the end, I think it's a feeling that you can't articulate or defend rationally. But to come back maybe to Phyllis's point, it's democracy and capitalism in their mind are one and the same thing. And they are actually, I don't know if they'll often use this language, but this movement is anti-democratic. Indeed, the whole DEI movement is about instilling norms essentially by diktat, and you can't accept majority votes on things, which is the essence of democracy, because if the majority are racist, then the things they vote for and the laws they pass and the politicians they elect are just going to reinforce these racist power structures. And so you have to dismantle them by executive order, in effect, right? So they are not actually fans of democracy. They're not actually fans of democracy because they think democracy, as represented in the United States, produced this capitalist, racist society that they're trying to overthrow. And indeed, who is it they support in every major conflict? They support the non-democratic party. They support the Palestinians, who are the most corrupt, tyrannical dictatorships that you could possibly imagine. And then they criticize Israel for being an imperfect democracy, which perhaps it is, because no such thing as a perfect democracy, and give the Palestinians a complete pass who don't even have the vestige, they don't even pretend to have a vestige of democracy. So I think in the end, and this is the irony, and I appreciate your point, they're against democracy and they're against capitalism, but it is democracy which gives them the freedom to protest. try protesting against the government in Gaza. Good luck with that. We see what Hamas does and most other Arab and Islamic countries. And it is capitalism which gives them the luxury of being at Harvard University or an elite university and having fancy tents and things like that. So they literally are Westerners against Western civilization, which is just at the very least stupid, right? It's just so mind-bogglingly stupid, and also ultimately self-refuting, ultimately
and and
self-refuting, right?
and I would say dangerous because we're talking
Dangerous,
about
right?
the leaders of tomorrow coming from these elite
Well,
universities.
I think you asked, or did you ask something about these? What happens on campus doesn't stay on campus, right? And this movement is at least 20 years old on our American campuses, as I said, and it's been growing, et cetera. And 20 years is already enough for several generations of college students to have graduated. And we're talking about the elite universities or the next tier. So these folks, they're in Congress, they're in the law, they're in the media, they're already leaders, right? If you look at the folks who are, in their late 30s or early 40s, they're the first wave of people who've come through this propaganda machine on campuses, and they are spreading throughout the society and into positions of leadership. And I know I've been yelling loudly since my eyes were opened in 2015. Like, this is a serious problem, even when it was only on a small number of campuses. To me, like, we need to stamp it out even there because indeed it spreads from a few campuses to many campuses to most of the at least major campuses. Any campus that has a significant Jewish population will have a movement like this, by the way. If there's no Jews, there's almost never any of these movements, which also tells you something else, right? These
Mhm.
movements say they're targeting Israel, but they're really targeting the Jews in their vicinity, part of the
Good point.
anti-Semitism of it. But yeah, these folks, and this is why I'm a depressing person at parties, we've lost the campus. I don't, what a victory for the Zionists. Just a night or two ago, I think it was at Princeton, the Israeli ambassador came to speak, and there was only a small protest, and it wasn't disrupted. And the Jewish people are like, success, victory. And if you think about how low that bar is, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, so it wasn't disrupted. That was one. Meanwhile, dozens of others are disrupted with mass protests. We've lost the campuses. Our
Mhm.
victory is when we occasionally can get a lecturer in. But meanwhile, student governments are all endorsing BDS against Israel. Student referenda are doing that. And if we've lost these campuses, what's the next 10 years going to look like? The next 20 years? It doesn't look positive to my eye. Doesn't
Right.
look positive to my eye, unfortunately.
So the US federal government has recently started to take severe measures against universities that don't do enough against anti-Semitism on campus. Can you please tell us what these measures are? And do you think these measures are appropriate and effective?
So that's another wonderful, potentially long question. But so there's been a number of measures, and I'm just glad something's happening. I know even bona fide Zionists have questions about some of these measures. The criticisms I'm hearing, and I'll mention the measure in just a second, are like, is this a bull in a china shop thing? Like using a hammer instead of a scalpel. So maybe the one that's gotten the most news is that the administration is cutting off federal funding to at least a few universities, Harvard, Brown, Princeton, I think Cornell, and a couple of other places, Johns Hopkins as well. And in some cases, billions of dollars, right? I think Harvard has already lost like $3 billion and threatened to lose $9 billion. And, in principle, that's a great and the demands are you have to fix your system. You can't allow the anti-Semitism, and there's very concrete demands that flesh that out. It's also a part of getting rid of and diminishing the DEI industry that governs campuses. You're not allowed to hire on the basis of race, not least because it actually violates civil rights law. So it's trying to get Harvard and Columbia to agree to essentially stop using DEI and actually put in place disciplinary measures, enforce your own rules, get rid of masking on campus, which is such an easy thing to do. Like, why wouldn't a campus, because these thug, when you put a mask on, people's behavior is a lot worse, right? So you should eliminate masking at protests, et cetera. The downside of that particular measure is most of the people suffering from the loss of grants are not actually the people guilty of the anti-Semitism. So, in the case of Colombia, most of these grants, they're supporting valuable medical and scientific research. And by and large, the anti-Israel movement is overwhelmingly humanities and social science people. It's growing in the sciences, but most scientists are not interested in the issue. They believe in objective truth. They don't want to politicize anything. It's the humanities and social science people who are really guilty of all the quote unquote the infractions, and yet it's the other people being penalized. And of course, who wants to harm medical and science research? That's not a good idea either. So that particular thing is complicated. My own hope there was that, if they just threatened two or three big universities, then everybody would get their act together, and maybe that would be an okay price to pay. I don't know. Some bona fide Zionists don't like this move at all. It's too heavy-handed. But on the other hand, it's pretty clear that these major universities are not going to change direction until they're forced to, and losing billions of funding is a way of forcing them. And by the way, they could respond by saying, "Okay, we'll fix it." Like that is available to them if this money's so important. And it's pretty shocking that they're not largely not saying that. Other measures in the same vein, like they're looking into removing tax exempt status from Ivy League universities and others, which would be a major blow to them. That would dry up a lot of donations, for example. So that's still the purse strings. They are, of course, they've stepped up as part of a larger campaign to, round up and deport either illegal immigrants or people on student visas. So that's what's most relevant to the campuses. There have been a number of prominent student leaders of these anti-Israel movements who have now been detained. They're on student visas. And then there's a lot of questions about what due process are they owed? They're not citizens. They're here on a visa. So they may not have committed a crime. Some of them have committed crimes, like the Colombia people were, breaking and entering buildings, damaging property, holding a janitor hostage. Those are actually crimes, right? So if he's committed a crime, there can be a criminal process. And, you get into the details I don't follow. The Secretary of State has discretion to, cancel a student visa if he just doesn't like the person. I think that's good. I think, the issue is, are you rounding up the right people? Because you don't want to send home someone who doesn't deserve it. But at least the major cases all seem to be people who were guilty of these infractions. So that's another technique. And, there's some other things as well, but that'll give you the flavor. And they're controversial. But the stunning thing is, and also actually requiring disciplinary processes. The
Oh,
most shocking thing of all these universities, all the protests we've seen, especially last year when many places had these encampments, students took over a part of campus, pitched tents, and lived there for days or weeks and refused to let Jews enter or Zionists enter and destroyed the lawns, etc. During those things, all of those violated school rules. Many schools had pretty good rules about protests are allowed, but there are time, place, and manner restrictions, and you're not allowed to disturb anyone else's rights to study and to go in a campus space. So massive violations of rules, and there were essentially no enforcement of those rules by almost any of these universities. And where there was any enforcement, it was light and not like some students got called in for disciplinary and then the charges were dismissed, like it was useless. So part of what the administration is requiring is you state your rules clearly and you follow your own rules. Like that seems to me a no-brainer, and no one could object to that. No reasonable person could object to that unless you hate Israel so much. And so you're allowed to break the rules if it's Israel and Jews you're attacking. And we all know just 2 days ago at Yale, they tried to set up another encampment. It got shut down quickly because they're afraid of Trump now. So it's working, right? These are working. But in the course of it, these anti-Israel students had cordoned off basically a part of campus. And there's some video of a couple of Jewish students who wanted to walk through, and they said, no, you can't go through here. And these were kids who were, wearing tzitzis. They were openly Jewish and kippot, etc. And some people online were saying, this really isn't a big deal. They could just go, they don't have to go around into that plaza. They just could go around the plaza. It wasn't like they were being held hostage. And all you need to say is just imagine some white nationalist or Ku Klux Klan people took over a piece of campus and then didn't let a black person in, right? We all know instantly The police would be there, the campus police, every student who participated would be seriously disciplined. It's not okay to make a black person even go around, right?
Right.
But for some reason, we have this vicious double standard. If as long as you're protesting Israel, as long as it's only Jews whose rights you're transgressing, we let them go. So to Yale's credit, they did get that shut down very quickly. They are allegedly pursuing some disciplinary procedures on some of the students who led it. So I think we are in a different era. And I think we're in that era because Trump, for better or for worse, he might be a bull in a china shop. He might be using a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel. But I think the situation is an emergency and a crisis. And maybe if, no scalpel will work, right? So maybe we need a little bit of a bull with a sledgehammer in a china shop. And it
And we
does seem
see,
to be getting results. So,
yeah, okay. And we see some results, right?
And I
all right.
think that's a very good place to stop. I think this has been a fascinating, fascinating conversation. I thank you. Yes. Okay. Israel Breeze, World Condemns.
May I just mention, please visit my website, andrewpesson.com, to find out more about me and my work. And you could, find more about that book there. I've been doing a Substack for about the past year. It's a free Substack. So if you want to follow, I've been writing quite voluminously. That's how I cope with this situation is I write. So I've been writing quite voluminously, documenting and analyzing all aspects of the turn against the Jews that we're seeing. So you can
And
find my Substack.
you're giving us great guidance with all your analysis.
Thank you. And I appreciate the questions were terrific. Really wonderful questions.
And we'll also put the URL underneath the description so that people will be able
Wonderful.
to spell Pessin, right?
Pessin, yes.
Uh, Easily. Anyway, I thank you so much for coming on the show. I thank our listeners. I uh, want to say that if you want to know more about Evelyn's work and my work, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And as we say, ending every show, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.
Indeed. We need all hands on deck, is the way I put it. Everyone has to do what they can.